August 4th, 1945. While the world celebrated the final days of World War II, inside Spaso House, the official residence of the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, a group of young Soviet schoolchildren presented Ambassador W. Averell Harriman with what appeared to be a gesture of friendship. They were the Young Pioneers, the Soviet Union's youth organization, and they carried with them a hand-carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States. It was beautiful, nearly 2 feet in diameter, masterfully crafted from dark wood with intricate details. The children sang songs. They smiled. They spoke of peace between nations. Harriman was touched. He had the seal mounted on the wall of his study, directly behind his desk, where he would conduct some of the most sensitive diplomatic conversations of the early Cold War. For the next 7 years, that seal hung there, innocent, decorative, patriotic. But here's the terrifying truth. Embedded deep within that wooden gift was one of the most ingenious espionage devices ever created. It had no batteries, no wires, no moving parts that could break or be detected, and it listened to everything. How is it possible that a device with no power source could transmit conversations across Moscow? How did American security experts, who swept the ambassador's office repeatedly, fail to detect it for 7 years? And when they finally discovered it, why did it take the United States another 9 years to figure out how it actually worked? The answers reveal a story of engineering brilliance, Cold War paranoia, and a technological breakthrough so advanced that it redefined the entire world of espionage. This is the story of The Thing, the passive cavity resonator that proved sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones that remain perfectly silent. To understand how The Thing came to exist, we need to understand the mind that created it. Leon Theremin. Yes, that theremin. The Russian inventor who created the theremin musical instrument, the eerie electronic device you've heard in countless science fiction films. But theremin was far more than a musical innovator. He was a physicist, an acoustics expert, and, whether willingly or under coercion, one of the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence assets. Born Lev Sergeyevich Terman in 1896 in St. Petersburg, Theremin had already revolutionized electronic music by the 1920s. He toured Europe and America, demonstrating his otherworldly instrument, even performing at Carnegie Hall. He rubbed shoulders with celebrities, inventors, and industrialists. Then, in 1938, something changed. Theremin vanished from New York City. His friends assumed he'd been kidnapped. The truth was somehow worse. He'd been recalled to the Soviet Union during Stalin's Great Purge. Instead of being executed like so many others, Theremin was put to work in a sharashka, a special Soviet labor camp where imprisoned scientists and engineers were forced to develop technology for the state. Here's the paradox. Theremin was simultaneously a prisoner and a privileged inventor, working in the secret laboratories of the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB. His genius was too valuable to waste. It was in this environment, surrounded by guards, living under constant surveillance, stripped of his freedom, that Theremin created what would become his most significant and secret invention. The challenge given to him was seemingly impossible. Create a listening device that could be placed inside the U.S. ambassador's residence, one that would be completely undetectable by the security sweeps that American counterintelligence conducted regularly. Traditional bugs of the era required power sources, batteries that would die, or electronic components that would emit telltale radio frequencies. The Americans were using the best detection equipment available. They swept for electrical signals. They searched for wires. They X-rayed suspicious objects. How do you hide a listening device from people who are actively looking for exactly that? Theramin's solution was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its execution. He would create a device with no power source at all. It would remain completely dormant, utterly passive, until activated remotely from outside the building. The technology he developed, the passive cavity resonator, would remain undetectable because, for all practical purposes, it didn't exist as an electronic device in the conventional sense. But creating it was one thing. Getting it into the ambassador's office was another challenge entirely. How do you plant a listening device in one of the most secure locations in Moscow? A building where every gift, every piece of furniture, every delivery is scrutinized. The answer? You disguise it as a symbol of friendship from children. The seal hung on the wall from 1945 to 1952. Think about what those 7 years encompassed. This was the birth of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade, the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb test, the beginning of the Korean War, the height of McCarthyism in America, the early stages of the space race. Every conversation about these world-changing events that took place in Ambassador Harriman's office, and later in the offices of his successors, Ambassadors Walter Bedell Smith and George F. Kennan, was transmitted directly to Soviet intelligence. The Americans had no idea. Security sweeps continued regularly. The embassy's security officers used the most sophisticated detection equipment available. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. No batteries slowly dying, no electronic circuits emitting radio frequencies, no wires leading anywhere suspicious. The seal was examined multiple times. It appeared to be exactly what it seemed: a carved piece of wood, hollow inside for resonance, a patriotic decoration. But how did it actually work? Inside the wooden seal, hidden within a carefully carved cavity, was a small cylindrical device about the size of a pencil. This device consisted of a tiny resonant cavity, essentially a small metal tube, with a flexible silver diaphragm at one end. When sound waves from conversations in the room struck this diaphragm, it would vibrate. These vibrations would subtly change the electrical capacitance of the cavity. Here's where Theramin's genius became apparent. Across the street from Spaso House, Soviet intelligence officers operated a transmitter that beamed a continuous radio signal, specifically around 330 megahertz, directly at the building. This signal, sometimes called an illuminating signal, would enter the resonant cavity inside the wooden seal. As the diaphragm vibrated from sound waves in the room, it would modulate this external radio signal. The modified signal would then reflect back, and Soviet receivers would capture it, demodulating it to extract the audio from the ambassador's conversations. The device drew all its power from the external radio beam. It generated no signal of its own. When the Soviets weren't actively illuminating it, the device was completely passive, just metal and wood, indistinguishable from any other decorative object. The information gathered was extraordinary. Soviet intelligence learned American negotiating positions before meetings even began. They understood internal debates within the State Department. They knew which diplomats were sympathetic to which policies. This intelligence helped shape Soviet foreign policy for 7 critical years of the early Cold War. Then came May 1952. During a routine security inspection, a British security officer noticed something unusual. Radio operator John W. Ford was conducting a standard sweep when his equipment picked up a strange signal. It seemed to be coming from inside the building, but it appeared and disappeared unpredictably. After extensive investigation, they finally traced the signal to the wooden seal. When American technicians carefully dismantled the seal, they found Theramin's device. Even then, they didn't fully understand what they were looking at. The device appeared too simple to function as described. Initial examinations were baffled by its design. How could something with no power source transmit audio? But the discovery posed an immediate diplomatic crisis. How do you announce to the world that your ambassador's office has been bugged for 7 years without appearing incompetent? How do you explain that some of the most sensitive diplomatic conversations of the early Cold War were compromised? The answer would involve a dramatic moment at the United Nations, but we'll get to that. First, there's the question that haunted American intelligence. If the Soviets could do this, what else had they planted? February 26, 1960. Nearly 8 years after the discovery of the listening device, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. stood before the UN Security Council, holding the wooden seal that had hung in the ambassador's office in Moscow. The setting was a session discussing Soviet espionage, and Lodge was about to deliver one of the most dramatic reveals in Cold War history. But why wait 8 years? Why didn't the United States immediately expose this violation of diplomatic protocol? The answer reveals the complex calculations of Cold War intelligence. First, American counterintelligence wanted time to study the device thoroughly, to understand its capabilities, and to determine if similar devices had been planted elsewhere. Second, they needed to develop countermeasures and detection methods for this entirely new type of surveillance technology. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the timing of the revelation could be used for maximum propaganda effect. The context of 1960 was crucial. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had been criticizing American espionage activities, particularly the U-2 spy plane program. Just months later, in May 1960, the Soviets would shoot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2 over Soviet territory, creating an international incident. Lodge's revelation was designed to counter Soviet accusations by demonstrating that the USSR had been conducting its own extensive espionage operations. When Lodge held up the seal and explained how it had been used to spy on American diplomats for 7 years, the revelation sent shockwaves through the international community. Here was physical proof of Soviet espionage, a tangible object that couldn't be dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. The wooden seal, with its hollow interior and hidden device, became one of the most photographed pieces of espionage equipment in history. But here's the remarkable part. Even by 1960, American engineers hadn't fully reverse-engineered how the device worked. They understood it was a passive resonator, that it required external illumination, but the precise physics of its operation remained somewhat mysterious. The device was so far ahead of its time that even 8 years later, with the world's best technical experts examining it, the full sophistication of Theremin's design wasn't entirely understood. The technology would eventually be declassified and studied more widely. Engineers at places like Bell Labs examined the principles and found applications in other fields. The passive resonator concept would influence the development of RFID technology decades later. Even today, the thing is studied in engineering courses as an example of elegant problem-solving under constraint. The diplomatic fallout was significant but measured. The United States used the revelation for propaganda purposes, but both superpowers understood the reality. Everyone spied on everyone. The incident added to the atmosphere of distrust and paranoia that characterized the Cold War, but it didn't fundamentally change the relationship between the US and USSR. The spy game continued, just with greater awareness of what was possible. Meanwhile, security protocols at embassies worldwide were completely overhauled. The discovery of the thing proved that traditional electronic sweeps weren't sufficient. Buildings needed to be shielded against external radio signals. Rooms needed to be constructed as Faraday cages. The entire approach to diplomatic security changed because of this single wooden seal. But what happened to the people involved? What became of the ambassadors who unknowingly had their conversations recorded for years? What happened to Theramin himself? And what lessons from this nearly 70-year-old incident remain relevant in our current age of digital surveillance? Let's start with the ambassadors. W. Averell Harriman, who first received the wooden seal, went on to have a distinguished career despite the compromise of his office. He served as Secretary of Commerce under President Truman, Governor of New York from 1955 to 1958, and later as a key negotiator for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson during the Vietnam War. When he learned in 1952 that his Moscow office had been bugged, he was reportedly furious, not just at the Soviets, but at the security failures that allowed it to happen. He lived to age 94, dying in 1986, and in interviews late in life expressed a grudging respect for the technical sophistication of the operation while condemning the breach of diplomatic norms. George F. Kennan, who was ambassador when the device was discovered, had perhaps the most complicated relationship with the incident. Kennan was the architect of the containment policy toward the Soviet Union, one of the most influential American diplomats of the 20th century. Learning that some of his most sensitive strategic traditions had been compromised for years was devastating. It contributed to his already growing disillusionment with his role in Moscow. He left the ambassadorship later in 1952 and spent the rest of his career as a historian and critic of American foreign policy, particularly nuclear weapons policy. He died in 2005 at age 101, and while he wrote extensively about the Cold War, he rarely discussed the bugging incident in detail. But the most tragic and complex figure in this story is Leon Theramin himself. After creating The Thing in the late 1940s while imprisoned in the Sharashka, Theramin continued to work on various projects for Soviet intelligence. He was eventually released and worked as an acoustics professor, but his earlier fame was deliberately suppressed by Soviet authorities. He lived in obscurity for decades, forbidden from discussing his work or traveling abroad. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Theramin's role in creating the listening device became publicly known. By then he was in his 90s. In 1991, he was finally allowed to travel to the West again, where he was received as both a musical pioneer and an espionage legend. Filmmaker Stephen M. Martin created the documentary Theramin, An Electronic Odyssey, 1993, which brought his story to a wider audience. When asked about creating The Thing, Theramin gave ambiguous answers. Some accounts suggest he was proud of the technical achievement, while uncomfortable with how it was used. Others suggest he had no choice: create it or face worse consequences in the Gulag system. The truth, as with so much of Theramin's life, remains partially obscured by the secrecy and oppression of the Soviet era. Theramin died in Moscow in 1993, just 2 years after his return to international recognition. He was 97 years old. In his final years, he witnessed both the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of a new era where his Theramin instrument was finding fresh appreciation in electronic music. But his greatest invention, the passive cavity resonator inside a wooden seal, remained classified and little discussed outside intelligence circles. Consider the paradox of Theramin's life. A man who created an instrument that made music from thin air, who brought wonder and beauty to audiences worldwide, also created one of history's most effective espionage devices. He was simultaneously a prisoner and a professor, a genius and a forced laborer, celebrated and suppressed. The Americans who discovered the device had their own complicated aftermath. The security officers who finally detected it received quiet commendations, but also faced questions about why it took 7 years. The technical experts who analyzed it wrote classified reports that informed defensive measures for decades. Some of those reports remained classified until the 1990s. But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't on individuals, but on institutions. The discovery fundamentally changed how governments approached security. It demonstrated that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that the most dangerous surveillance might be the kind that leaves no trace until it's too late. So what does this 70-year-old story mean for us today, in an era of digital surveillance far beyond anything Theramin could have imagined? The original wooden seal sits today in the National Cryptologic Museum near Fort Meade, Maryland, home of the National Security Agency. Visitors can see it behind glass, a piece of wood that changed the world. But its lessons resonate far beyond a museum display. The Thing established principles that define modern surveillance, that the most effective monitoring systems are the ones you never know are there, that power doesn't always come from within a device, but can be harvested from the environment, that the line between gift and weapon can be invisible. Consider how these principles manifest today. Your smartphone likely contains dozens of sensors: accelerometers, gyroscopes, barometers, magnetometers, that collect data constantly. These sensors, like Theramin's passive resonator, respond to environmental conditions and transmit information. The microphone on your laptop can be remotely activated. Smart home devices listen for wake words, but must process all audio to detect them. The Internet of Things has filled our homes with devices that, like that wooden seal, sit innocuously on shelves and walls while capable of surveillance. The passive aspect of the Thing also finds modern equivalents. RFID chips require no battery, drawing power from the radio waves used to interrogate them, exactly the same principle Theramin employed in 1945. Passive radar systems detect aircraft by analyzing reflections of commercial radio and TV signals. Energy harvesting from Wi-Fi signals and cellular networks can power small sensors indefinitely. The geopolitical implications also echo forward. In 2017, news outlets reported that Marine One, the president's helicopter, had been grounded due to concerns about counterfeit chips in its communications systems, potentially compromised by foreign intelligence. In 2019, the U.S. government banned Huawei telecommunications equipment from federal systems, citing espionage concerns. The questions are the same ones from 1952. How do you trust technology when you can't fully audit it? How do you defend against attacks you can't detect? The wooden seal taught intelligence agencies that diplomatic spaces require extraordinary protection. That's why modern SCIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities, are built with extensive shielding, sound dampening, and regular security sweeps, using technology far more sophisticated than what was available in the 1950s. That's why some of the most sensitive conversations still happen in rooms with no electronics whatsoever, or in open-air locations where surveillance is more difficult. But here's what's changed: scale. Theramin's device could monitor one room. Modern digital surveillance operates at a scale he couldn't have imagined. The documents Edward Snowden revealed in 2013 showed intelligence agencies collecting data on millions of people simultaneously. The difference isn't just quantitative, but qualitative. It's the difference between a targeted operation and dragnet surveillance. Yet, the Thing reminds us that sometimes the most powerful capabilities come from elegant simplicity rather than brute force. Today's cybersecurity often focuses on complex code and sophisticated attacks, but some of the most effective intrusions use simple social engineering, the modern equivalent of children presenting a gift to an ambassador. The story also highlights a timeless truth about security. It's a perpetual arms race. The Americans eventually detected the device. They developed countermeasures. Then new techniques emerged that bypassed those countermeasures. Today, artificial intelligence can analyze patterns of behavior to detect anomalies that might indicate surveillance. But AI can also be used to make surveillance more sophisticated and harder to detect. What happened to all the ambassadors who were surveilled? They moved on with their careers, their private conversations now footnotes in history books. What happened to Theramin? He died, recognized but not fully appreciated, his greatest achievement something he could barely discuss. What happened to the technology? It evolved, becoming simultaneously more sophisticated and more ubiquitous, until surveillance became ambient, everywhere and nowhere. A wooden seal. 7 years. 0 power consumption. Infinite consequences. What changed because of this story? The entire paradigm of diplomatic security, yes, but more fundamentally, our understanding of what surveillance could be. Before the thing, people imagined spies as people with equipment. After it, we understood that anything could be equipment. Any object could be a spy. What lesson remains today? That the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That the most dangerous compromises are the ones you don't know about. That security isn't achieved through a single sweep, but through continuous vigilance. That sometimes the most sophisticated attack is the one that requires nothing sophisticated to execute. How did the world transform in unexpected ways? We live now in what some call the golden age of surveillance, not despite the thing, but partially because of it. The device proved that passive, undetectable monitoring was possible. Everything since has been a variation on that theme, scaled up through digital technology until privacy itself became a technical problem rather than a natural state. The wooden seal hangs in its museum case, silent now as it was silent then. But its resonance continues, in every device that listens when we think it's off, in every system that watches when we think we're alone, in every gift that might be something else. Theremin created an instrument that made music from nothing. He also created a device that made intelligence from silence. Both demonstrated the same principle, that the most powerful forces are often the ones we cannot see or hear, the ones that exist in the spaces between. The thing listened for 7 years without saying a word. Perhaps that's the most important thing it ever taught us. Sometimes, silence speaks loudest of all. In the age of Alexa and Siri, of smart speakers and always-on microphones, we've invited the thing into our homes voluntarily. The question isn't whether we're being listened to. The question is whether we've even bothered to ask.